The sea boiled beneath the dawn of February 19th, 1945. For days, American warships had unleashed an unrelenting barrage on a small patch of volcanic rock called Iwo Jima, an island barely 8 square miles wide, yet destined to become one of the bloodiest stages of World War II. When the shelling stopped, silence fell for a heartbeat, then the gates of hell opened. Waves of used Marines surged toward the black beaches, boots sinking deep into volcanic ash as mortar erupted all around them. Hidden in the labyrinth of tunnels beneath Mount Suribachi, Japanese forces waited patiently. They had turned the island into a fortress, one that would take fire, steel, and unimaginable sacrifice to capture. The air burned with sulfur and smoke. Communication lines snapped as chaos spread across the beachhead. Officers shouted orders drowned by the roar of gunfire, and in that confusion, clarity became as rare as calm. But amid the thunder of battle, a new kind of voice began to cut through the storm. Over the crackle of Marine radios came words that sounded ancient, rhythmic, musical, and completely foreign to anyone who heard them. Tingloi, Wolachi, Ayasin. The Japanese intercepted the transmissions instantly, confident they had captured another Allied message. But no amount of code breaking, no amount of linguistic expertise could pierce the meaning of what they heard. To their trained ears, it was nothing but noise, yet to a small group of Marines, those strange words carried life or death orders, coordinates, commands, and calls for fire. Each syllable carried precision, discipline, and the pulse of a culture centuries old. This was not a cipher born from machines. It was the living language of a people whose voices had endured long before the war began. A language never written down, passed only by word and memory. And now, on the black sands of Iwo Jima, it had become one of America's greatest weapons. For the first time in the Pacific War, Allied messages moved freely, secure, instant, and unbreakable. Behind the thunder of artillery and the desperate cries of men, a quiet revolution was taking place in the ether of the battlefield, carried by voices that few outside their homeland had ever heard. They were called Code Talkers, Navajo warriors who turned their sacred language into the one code Imperial Japan could never decipher. Through their words, battles were won. Through their silence, lives were saved. But the story of how these men came to wield such power, how an ancient language became the key to victory, begins far from the roar of Iwo Jima. It begins in the heart of the American Southwest, under red cliffs and endless sky, where the Navajo people had fought a different kind of war, one for their identity, their dignity, and their survival, long before the thunder of war rolled across the Pacific. Before the world even knew the word Code Talker, a quiet language lived beneath the vast skies of the American Southwest. It flowed through sandstone canyons, across dry mesas, and into the hearts of a people who called themselves the Dine, the people. To outsiders, they were known as the Navajo. To themselves, they were descendants of the Red Earth, bound by stories as old as the wind. Their language was their lifeblood, sacred, unwritten, and fiercely guarded. It carried their prayers, their songs, their history. Each word was more than a sound. It was a connection to the land, to ancestors, to the spirit of endurance that had kept them alive through centuries of hardship. But in the early decades of the 20th century, that language was under attack. Across the American West, Navajo children were taken from their homes and sent to government-run boarding schools. There, the songs and words of their people were forbidden. Teachers washed their mouths with soap for speaking Navajo, forcing English upon them as a means to civilize them. For many, their language became something whispered only at night, a secret rebellion against a world trying to erase who they were. And yet, the language endured. Passed from parent to child, it survived in quiet defiance, invisible to the world that dismissed it. By the time World War II erupted, Few outside the Navajo Nation even knew the language existed, and fewer still could understand it. It was considered too complex, too strange, too foreign to matter in the machinery of global war. But history has a strange way of transforming the overlooked into the essential. When Imperial Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States found itself thrust into a new kind of war, one where information moved faster than bullets, and secrets could win or lose entire battles. Across the Pacific, American forces fought desperately to maintain secure communications, but the Japanese had already proven themselves masters of interception. They broke Allied codes with terrifying efficiency, ambushing convoys, predicting attacks, and turning the chaos of war to their advantage. The U.S. military needed a solution, something faster, more reliable, and utterly unbreakable. And somewhere in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, the answer already existed. It didn't lie in machines or mathematics. It lay in the minds of a people who had once been silenced for speaking their own words. The Navajo language, once punished, now poised to protect. Its complex tones, endless variations, and lack of written form made it nearly impossible for non-native speakers to learn. There was no dictionary, no grammar book, no record to decipher. To those who didn't grow up immersed in it, Navajo sounded like nothing else on earth, and to the right listener, it sounded like the perfect code. Soon, that language, once whispered in the shadows of suppression, would become the very key to victory in the largest war the world had ever seen. The idea was as unlikely as it was brilliant. In the winter of 1942, a man named Philip Johnston walked into the U.S. Marine Corps' headquarters in California with a proposal that sounded almost absurd. Johnston wasn't Navajo. He was the son of a missionary who had lived among the dying as a child. He had grown up speaking their language, playing with Navajo children, absorbing the sounds and rhythms of their world. Now, decades later, as the world burned in the fires of war, he remembered something no one else had considered. The Navajo tongue might be the key to solving the Marines' communication crisis. At first, the officers were skeptical. They had heard outlandish ideas before: invisible ink, coded drums, even trained pigeons. But Johnston's conviction was unshakable. He explained that Navajo was unlike any other language on Earth. It had no written alphabet, no standard structure, and could not be understood or translated without lifelong immersion. And beyond its complexity lay something more valuable. It was a living language used by thousands of Navajo men and women every day, making it easy for native speakers to transmit and understand it instantly, without delay. Intrigued, the Marines agreed to a test. Johnston assembled 4 Navajo speakers and brought them to a small base in Camp Elliott, near San Diego. The officers handed them a series of English messages, coordinates, commands, troop movements, and asked them to translate them into Navajo, transmit them across the radio, and then decode them back into English. The results stunned everyone in the room. While the Marine cryptographers' codes took hours or even days to send and decipher, the Navajo team completed theirs in seconds, flawlessly, without a single error. In a war where seconds could decide the fate of entire battalions, this wasn't just impressive. It was revolutionary. Within weeks, the Marine Corps authorized a top-secret program to recruit and train Navajo men for a new kind of mission, one that demanded both linguistic brilliance and battlefield courage. They would not fight with tanks or planes. They would fight with words. The first group, a pilot program of just 29 recruits, was summoned to boot camp in May 1942. Many had never left their reservations before. They spoke a language the government had once punished them for using, and now, that same government was asking them to weaponize it. Each of these men carried not only a rifle, but also a burden of trust. They were being asked to transform their sacred tongue into a tool of war. At Camp Pendleton, their days began before sunrise. They trained like every other Marine, crawling, climbing, but their nights were spent in secret rooms, inventing an entirely new system of coded communication. Faced a unique challenge. There were no Navajo words for machine gun, battleship, or grenade. So, they created them. A dive bomber became a chicken. Hawk, a submarine, was a metal fish. A hand grenade was a potato. America itself became our mother. Each translation had to be simple enough to memorize, yet vague enough to confuse any outsider. In just a few months, they built an entire vocabulary of over 200 military terms, later expanded to more than 600. The result was a living code, layered with metaphor and meaning that only they could understand. And unlike any cipher before it, it could never be written down. It existed only in memory, carried in the minds of those who spoke it. By the end of 1942, the Marine Corps had its first group of fully trained Navajo Code Talkers ready for combat. They would be sent to the front lines of the Pacific, into jungles and beaches where radio operators rarely survived a day. What they carried with them wasn't just a code. It was the rebirth of a language once silenced, a voice that would now speak for freedom. The California coast shimmered beneath a pale sun as the first Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Pendleton. They were young, many barely in their 20s, quiet, watchful, carrying the spirit of the desert within them. Some had never seen the ocean before. Now they were staring at it from the edge of a world at war. They had answered a call that felt both strange and sacred. For generations, their people had endured efforts to erase their language. Now that same language was being asked to defend a nation that had once sought to silence it. The Marines wasted no time. From the moment they stepped off the trucks, the recruits were thrown into a relentless rhythm, drilling, running, crawling through mud, scaling ropes, and learning to fight like any other Marine. But behind the physical strain lay something far more demanding, the secret mission that brought them there. At night, while others slept, the Navajo men gathered in dimly lit barracks, working in whispers to build the backbone of the Unbreakable Code. Sheets of paper were forbidden. Everything had to be committed to memory. Every word, every symbol, every substitution had to live in their minds. They practiced until exhaustion blurred the edges of day and night. Over time, the language that had been their birthright evolved into a precision tool of war. They created systems for letters and words, assigning Navajo terms to represent each letter of the English alphabet. Wolachi meant ant, shush meant bear, Jew meant elk. Together, these simple words could spell out messages faster than any machine, and far beyond the reach of enemy codebreakers. But more than vocabulary, the Code Talkers trained to think in both worlds, Navajo and English, tradition and technology, culture and combat. They became living translators between ancient wisdom and modern warfare. Discipline was everything. The secrecy surrounding their mission was absolute. They couldn't speak of their work, not to friends, not to other Marines, not even to their families. Their mission was so classified that few outside the Marine Corps even knew it existed. Still, they formed an unbreakable brotherhood. Around campfires and in the quiet of night, they told stories of home, of mesas glowing red beneath the setting sun, of sheep herding and family gatherings, of prayers whispered to the wind. Those memories reminded them why they were there. Their voices carried the echo of generations, and in that sound was something indestructible. When their training ended, the final tests came swiftly. Drill instructors barked orders, radios buzzed with simulated commands, and messages flew between Navajo operators across vast distances. Time after time, the results were flawless. An English message that once took half an hour to encrypt and decode could now be sent and understood in under 20 seconds. The Navajo Code wasn't just fast. It was alive. When they graduated, they were Marines first, warriors trained to fight, bleed, and die beside their brothers in arms. But they also carried a second weapon, the invisible one. A weapon made of words and heritage, older than the nation they served. In the summer of 1942, the first Code Talkers were deployed to the Pacific. Their orders were simple and monumental: maintain secure communications under fire, no matter the cost. As their ships sailed west, the men stood on the decks watching the coastline fade, the homeland shrinking into the horizon. Ahead lay an ocean of unknown battles, but inside them burned the quiet knowledge that their words, their language, might change the course of history. The Pacific was a world of endless water and unforgiving heat, an ocean scattered with islands that became names written in blood: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, places that, before the war, meant nothing to most Americans, now stood at the center of the world's fiercest battles. In August 1942, the first group of Navajo Code Talkers set foot on Guadalcanal, a jungle island thick with rain, insects, and death. The Marines who landed there found not just an enemy, but an environment that wanted to kill them too. Malaria, exhaustion, and fear stalked them as surely as bullets. The Code Talkers arrived quietly, blending into the ranks like any other Marines. Most of their comrades didn't even know why they were there. Some looked at them with curiosity, others with doubt. Few could imagine that these soft-spoken men carried within them a secret weapon more powerful than any rifle. Their first test came quickly. The Japanese were intercepting every Allied radio transmission, turning American orders into ambushes. Confusion ruled the battlefield. Then, the Navajo operators stepped forward. They set up their radios under fire, the air screaming with mortar shells. As the Japanese closed in, they began to transmit, fast, calm, deliberate. The strange musical tones of the Navajo language crackled through the static. Orders that had once taken minutes to code were now sent in seconds. Within moments, artillery found its targets. Reinforcements arrived in the right place at the right time. The tide began to shift. Japanese intelligence listened in, desperate to understand. Their linguists pored over the transmissions, convinced it must be some new cipher. But the patterns defied all logic. The language was alive, fluid, unpredictable, beyond the reach of decoding machines. For the Marines on the ground, results spoke louder than mystery. The Code Talkers had proven themselves. Their accuracy was perfect, their speed unmatched. Commanders who once doubted the program now demanded Navajo operators for every major engagement. At Guadalcanal, the Unbreakable Code had its baptism by fire, and it did not fail. As months passed, the Code Talkers spread across the Pacific to Tarawa, Bougainville, Peleliu, and dozens of nameless atolls. They carried their radios and headsets through swamps and foxholes, over mountains and beaches, in the thick of battle, while bullets tore through the air. Their voices never faltered. Their mission was simple but sacred: to speak clearly, quickly, and correctly, to keep communication flowing when chaos threatened to silence it. Sometimes they worked in pairs, one speaking, one writing, both trusting each other completely. Their bond became stronger than fear. Marines soon began to say, "When the Navajos talk, the enemy dies." Yet the Code Talkers asked for no praise. They saw themselves not as heroes, but as duty-bound warriors serving both their people and their country. They knew the irony of their mission. The same language that had once been forbidden in schools was now saving American lives by the thousands. On the battlefield, there was no time to think about history's contradictions. There was only survival and the unyielding pulse of the radio, carrying Navajo words through the roar of war. By 1943, the Pacific had become a graveyard of ships and men. The ocean stretched endlessly, each island fortress demanding a new price in blood. But the tide of war was beginning to shift. And at the heart of that shift, carried in whispers, code, and courage, were the Navajo Code Talkers. Their reputation had grown quietly among the ranks. Commanders no longer questioned their presence. Now, every major Marine division requested Navajo communicators. They were no longer an experiment, they were essential. On the island of Tarawa, where coral reefs trapped landing craft and Japanese fire cut Marines down in the surf, the Code Talkers worked from shallow trenches, their radios protected by sandbags and prayer. In the chaos when maps were useless and positions changed by the minute, Navajo messages guided the advance. Reinforcements arrived on time. Ammunition reached the right units. Every syllable carried weight, precision, and trust. At Saipan, their code carried even greater power. The island was defended by more than 30,000 Japanese troops, fanatical, dug in, determined to die before surrender. The battle raged for weeks through jungles, cliffs, and villages reduced to ash. Communication was life. The Code Talkers kept it alive. Their words moved faster than the enemy could react. Airstrikes landed exactly where they were needed. Artillery found hidden bunkers. Entire units survived because a message, once vulnerable to interception, now traveled instantly and safely. Marine officers described the code as the fastest, most secure system ever devised. It wasn't hyperbole, it was truth. Japanese intelligence, still desperate to crack the mystery, failed again and again. The sounds made no sense. The structure defied all known rules. Even captured Navajos, if any had been taken, could not have revealed the secret, because the military code built within the language was known only to the Code Talkers themselves. Each man carried the code in his memory. Nothing written, nothing recorded. Their minds were their armor, their language their weapon. The battles intensified. Guam, Peleliu, Leyte. The Marines pressed forward, island by island, closer to the Japanese homeland. And with every advance, the Code Talkers went with them. Radios slung over their shoulders, their voices steady amid the noise of war. Between battles, they slept where they could, under trees, beside wrecked tanks, in shallow foxholes filled with rain. They rarely spoke of what they did. Their work was classified, their heroism invisible, but among those who fought beside them, their legend grew. Veterans recalled moments when everything seemed lost, when confusion reigned and defeat loomed, until a calm Navajo voice over the radio restored order. Some said their voices carried a kind of power, not just military efficiency, but something older, a quiet strength drawn from generations of survival. As the Allied push gained momentum, the Navajo Code became the backbone of Marine communication. It was never broken, never compromised, never doubted. From the beaches of Tarawa to the cliffs of Saipan, from the jungles of Bougainville to the rocky shores of Guam, the Navajo Code Talkers had proven what few could have imagined, that the language once silenced by force had become a fortress that no enemy could breach. Their work had turned the tide, but their greatest test was still to come. An island unlike any other, a fortress the Japanese vowed to hold to the last man. It was called Iwo Jima. The winter of 1945 brought the Pacific War to its breaking point. The Allied advance had reached the doorstep of Japan itself. Ahead lay a small volcanic island, 8 square miles of black ash and stone. Its name was Iwo Jima. To the Japanese, it was sacred ground, the last shield before their homeland. To the Americans, it was a necessary hell, a stepping stone for bombers that would soon strike the heart of Tokyo. The Marines knew what awaited them. They had seen enough battles to understand what it meant to land on a fortress. But even they could not imagine what Iwo Jima would demand of them. In February 1945, before dawn, the invasion fleet gathered off the island. The sea churned with ships, destroyers, carriers, transports, a floating city preparing for the storm. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and fear. As naval guns thundered and the horizon erupted in flame, the Navajo Code Talkers readied their radios. Their equipment was simple: a handset, a notebook of call signs, a small generator humming at their feet. But what they carried in their minds was beyond measure, the Unbreakable Code. When the Marines hit the beaches, the world seemed to explode. The volcanic sand swallowed their boots. Machine guns cut through the surf. Every inch of the island was pre-sighted, every step under fire. Yet through the chaos, through smoke, screams and shattered earth, the Code Talkers' voices rose. Calm and sure, they sent the first messages of the battle, guiding waves of men through the killing zones, relaying coordinates for artillery, calling in airstrikes from the ships offshore. Their transmissions were flawless. At headquarters, the officers could hardly believe it. In the first 48 hours of combat, Navajo operators sent and received more than 800 messages, every one without a single error. The battle raged day and night. The island offered no cover, only black rock and the smell of burning sulfur. Marines fought yard by yard, bunker by bunker. The Japanese defended with a fanaticism that defied logic. They hid in tunnels and caves, striking from the shadows, then vanishing underground. The Code Talkers carried their radios wherever the front moved. Sometimes they transmitted from shell holes, sometimes from caves lit by the flicker of gunfire. Their voices cut through static and terror alike. Send. Reinforcements. Enemy advancing from the north. Ridge. Request bombardment. Target. Coordinates follow. Each phrase was born from centuries of oral tradition, words once spoken only in ceremony, now echoing across a battlefield half a world away. The Marines came to trust those voices completely. When confusion reigned, the Code Talkers brought clarity. When orders were lost in the chaos, they restored command. On the fifth day, the American flag rose over Mount Suribachi, a moment frozen in history. Yet below that iconic image, the battle still raged on. For weeks, the fighting continued, brutal and unrelenting. Through it all, the Code Talkers never faltered. Their radios crackled even as shells burst around them, even as friends fell beside them. They transmitted, received, repeated, the invisible lifeline of the entire invasion. A Marine officer later said, "Without the Navajo Code Talkers, we would never have taken Iwo Jima." He was right. The code had done what no machine, no cipher, no encryption ever could. It had turned language into a shield, a bridge, a weapon of survival. By the time Iwo Jima was secured, nearly 7,000 Marines lay dead. The island was nothing but ruin. Yet amid that devastation, one truth stood unbroken. The code had held. Not once had the enemy deciphered it. For the Navajo men who fought there, the victory was bittersweet. They had seen the cost of war up close. They had felt the weight of lives carried on their words. But they had also proven something far greater, that their language, their culture, and their spirit were stronger than any force on earth. In the silence that followed, as the Pacific winds blew over the ashes of Iwo Jima, their voices lingered, echoes of courage carried on the airwaves of history. The war ended not with a single battle, but with an unbearable stillness. After years of thunder and fire, the Pacific grew quiet. The bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered. The killing was over. The men who survived, those who had crossed oceans, storms, and nightmares, began their long journey home. Among them were the Navajo Code Talkers. They returned not to fanfare or parades, but to the quiet of the desert, to the mesas, canyons, and red earth that had shaped them long before the war began. For many, the return was disorienting. One day they were Marines, the guardians of a secret that had saved countless lives. The next, they were home, anonymous, their mission unspoken. Their families asked where they had been, what they had done. They could not answer. The program was still classified. Their code, their victories, their sacrifices, all sealed away by the military silence. So they carried their stories alone. Some took jobs on ranches or in mines. Others went back to school. Some never spoke of the war again. At night, the sounds of artillery still echoed in their dreams. The smell of sulfur, the crackle of radio static, memories that never faded. In the wider world, few even knew they had existed. History's spotlight had already moved on to the generals, the flag raisings, the cities rebuilt. The Navajo Code Talkers vanished into the background of victory. And yet, within their silence, there was a quiet dignity. They had not fought for glory or recognition. They had fought for duty, to protect their brothers in arms, and to honor their people's spirit. Still, the contrast was bitter. Many had grown up in government boarding schools, punished for speaking their native tongue. Teachers washed their mouths with soap, struck them for using Navajo words. But when war came, that same language, once beaten out of them, became America's most vital weapon. The irony was heavy, the pain unspoken. Even so, they did not turn bitter. They lived their lives quietly, as fathers, grandfathers, shepherds, teachers. Their code remained their burden, and their pride. It would take decades before the truth finally surfaced. In 1968, more than 20 years after the war, the military declassified the Code Talker program. The secret that had once saved the Pacific was finally revealed to the world. By then, many of the original Code Talkers had grown old. Some had passed away, their heroism unacknowledged. But for those still living, recognition came, slowly and with tears. The Marine Corps honored them. Congress offered medals. Schools began to teach their story. For the first time, the nation began to understand what these men had done, how their voices, once silenced, had spoken freedom into existence. Yet for the Code Talkers themselves, fame was never the goal. They were men of humility. When asked about their achievements, they spoke softly, often changing the subject. It wasn't just us, some would say. We all fought together. But history knows the truth. Without their code, without their courage, the Pacific War might have been lost or cost far more lives. Their language had carried not only orders, but the heartbeat of a people who refused to vanish. As the sun set over the mesas of the Southwest, and the last of the Code Talkers looked back on their lives, they could see what their ancestors had always known, that words hold power, that language is more than speech. It is identity. It is survival. And in the end, it was their words, born from the songs and stories of their people, that carried the sound of victory across the world. Time moves differently in the desert. The wind carries stories, the sand remembers footsteps, and voices linger long after the speakers are gone. Today, if you travel through Navajo Nation, across the endless horizons of red stone and blue sky, you might still hear the faint echo of a language that once turned the tide of a world at war. That is the sound of survival, of identity, of the unbroken code. The Navajo Code Talkers are few now. Many have walked on, leaving behind their medals, their radios, and a silence filled with meaning. But their story lives, not just in museums or textbooks, but in the language itself. Once, that language was outlawed. Children were forbidden to speak it. Then, it became the key to victory. Now it stands as a monument, not of stone or steel, but of sound. The code they built, born from ancient words and sacred roots, remains unbroken to this day. No enemy ever cracked it. No machine ever decoded it. It stands as one of the only truly unbreakable codes in military history. But beyond the strategy and secrecy, there lies something deeper, a story of resilience. The Code Talkers did not just defend a nation. They preserved a culture. In the darkest years of the 20th century, they proved that language itself can be a weapon of light, that identity, long suppressed, could become a source of strength. In classrooms across America, children now learn their story. They hear how young Navajo men once stepped from the mesas of Arizona and New Mexico into the heart of war, how they spoke words that no outsider could understand. Yet every Marine depended on. They learned that language, like freedom, must be protected. Today, young Navajo students study their ancestors' code with pride. Linguists preserve the words that once carried orders across battlefields. Tribes work to keep the language alive, not as a relic, but as a living voice. In 2001, the surviving Code Talkers received the Congressional Gold Medal, America's highest civilian honor. For some, it came too late. For others, just in time. They stood in quiet dignity as their story was finally told. The truth of their service carried at last into the light. But even then, when asked about their heroism, they spoke humbly. "We were just doing our job," they would say. To them, duty was sacred. Pride was silent. And yet, what they did was extraordinary. They proved that courage takes many forms. Some storm beaches, some hold the line, and some, with nothing but words, change the course of history. As the sun sets over the desert and the stars rise, the same stars those young men once navigated by. Halfway around the world, their voices seem to ride on the wind once more. Dain Bizad Du Shia and Bahane. The story of our language and our people. A story that endures. A story that can never be silenced. Because the code, their code, was never just about war. It was about survival. It was about identity. It was about the power of a people who refused to be forgotten. And as long as their language is spoken, as long as one voice rises to speak in Navajo, the code will remain unbroken.